My name is David Gross. I'm the program manager for Metro Bridge, which is part of the Innichon Cities. And I manage our fellowships and internships, as well as our Metro Bridge is our experiential learning program and classes. We are super excited because today we're going to be able to celebrate Anne's work as the Menino Fellow last year. And we should have Walter Montano, who up until this year, he's actually leaving VU, but has been the program director for the VU and DC program, which is where students take classes while they are in the spring portion of the Menino Fellowship. Walter hopefully will be joining us momentarily to talk a little bit about just the logistics of the DC program and what it's like. But first, I just wanted to give everyone an overview of what the Menino Fellowship is. So first, if you're interested in applying, applications are going to be due probably in about 2 months. I don't have an exact date for you, and they will open up by Friday. So everything's approved. We just need to finalize the deadline before I can open up applications. The website, if you go to bu.edu/IOC, if you go to student fellowships, or for students, you'll find our fellowships and stuff. You can also go to bu.edu/IOC/Menino Fellowship. And if you registered for this event, when applications go up, you'll get an email from me telling you that applications are up. So, and if you didn't register, you can still register, I think. You can still register. So if you find the link for this event, and then you'll be on my list. Email. The Menino Fellowship is a long-standing partnership between the Innichon Cities and the National League of Cities, which is an organization that supports cities, and it's like a city advocacy organization based in Washington, D.C., and it basically provides resources, supports, and lobbying support on behalf of cities and towns of all sizes across the United States. So it's nonpartisan. There are Republican mayors and Democratic mayors and nonpartisan mayors, and basically the goal of the organization is not to be partisan, but rather to support cities and the work that they do. The Menino Fellow works specifically with a portion of the National League of Cities, which used to be called the Institute for Youth Education and Families, but is now the Center for Youth Education and Families within a larger, it basically moved within a larger umbrella, but it's the same thing. And the reason for that is because the fellowship is named after the Innichon City's founder, who was the late mayor of Boston, Mayor Menino, Tom Menino. And so Mayor Menino also coincidentally founded the Institute for Youth Education and Families to be able to support cities, support families, when he was working with the National League of Cities. So because of that connection, we, upon his passing, wanted to honor him, and we worked with the National League of Cities. The National League of Cities actually worked with us to create this fellowship, and we've been having it for, I want to say, 6 or 7 years now, longer.
I think it's approaching 10th year.
Yeah, right? It's pretty much since the beginning of the Innichon Cities. So it's been an amazing opportunity for students. It's a pretty big commitment. So it consists of a fall-directed study, which you will do with the director of the Innichon Cities, which in this case is Loretta Lees, who's a professor of sociology. She's one of the world's foremost experts on gentrification. So if you have interest in gentrification, she's great. But really, if you're interested in urban studies in general, she's a very wonderful urbanist. And your directed study does not have to be about gentrification at all, if that's not something that interests you. By chance, the last two fellows, including Anne and our current fellow, have focused on housing policy because it seems to be a pertinent topic, which makes perfect sense. And so that's a possible area of study, but really the directed study just needs to be about an urban area of interest. That directed study can be anywhere from 2 to 6 credits, depending on what your course load is. The application will require you to submit a proposal for it. If you have questions, email me. That's a common theme that comes up, and I can answer some questions about it later. The spring semester requires you to apply in the fall. You will be accepted if you're accepted to the fellowship, I promise. I don't promise, but I promise. I shouldn't say that while I'm being recorded, but we've never had a fellow who, if you're accepted to the fellowship, you're almost certainly qualified to go to the global program in DC. So you have to apply for the DC internship program, which is part of BU's Washington DC program, which is part of like the study abroad, not, it's, you know, off campus. And so the DC internship program, Walter will talk about it if and when, he's probably running late from a meeting, he's able to make it, and you can talk about his experience as well in it. Students take classes through the program, just like you would if you studied abroad anywhere. But what's really interesting is the program is intended for you to have an internship. As part of that, the Menino Fellowship, you are already placed in your internship, so you don't have to stress about finding one, which is, hey, I was just talking about the DC program. So, so students in the DC program have so the fellow interns full-time, or it's almost full-time, it's like 30 hours a week? 35 hours a week with the National League of Cities, and it's a wonderful opportunity. Monday through Thursday, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, Monday through Thursday, with Friday sort of dedicated to like coursework.
And
Yeah, and it's paid, right, yeah. And unlike some internships, it is fully paid. And so the National League, the pay, you'll see the pay rate once we haven't agreed on the pay rate for this year, so it might say something like approximately when you go to the application page, but it'll be at least as high as you see the number, if not a little bit higher if there's an increase. But I'm not sure if there will be. So that being said, we're gonna organize this event a little bit out of order, as you just heard me talk about the directed study, which Anne's gonna talk about. But first, Walter Montano is gonna be able to talk about the DC program. So I wanted to give Walter a few minutes to be able to talk about what the experience is like in the DC program. I know there's students always have questions about like what the living situation is like, what housing is like, what costs are like, what classes are like. So Walter, if you want to speak for 15 minutes or so.
Yeah.
Yeah. Awesome. We are recording for people who can't attend, just so you know.
Better, I guess.
Yeah.
Okay, I apologize for the latest. Whenever I come up here, I'm literally running up and down Common Ave. So I literally had a session in at 12, and I was like speeding, literally running. But anyway, it's great to see all of you, from Stacy to Ting to David's work. I know there's a lot of and Anne, of course, this has sort of come to fruition situation for us. We've run this program now as a partnership with the BUIOC for 7-8 years now. So I can remember the first student who did this when Professor Graham Wilson sort of started this whole idea with the political science department. And he was saying, how can we get students to go down to DC and not just necessarily do politics, even though that's the political sciences, the bread and butter and passion. But we were thinking, okay, well, how else can we partner? So this became a great model for us as a program in Washington, 47 years running, longest running abroad away program. And it became a great model. Our only issue was, can we have 3 fellows at the IOC every semester, not just for our purposes, but just because the breadth and depth of the work that they do, which you'll see here today with Anne's work, is solid. It's the kind of work that we would aspire for every undergrad to have that type of experience where they can work someplace, get paid, engage in the city, invest in a cause, which is obviously urban planning, but also a little bit of everything there, but also elaborate on the options for their own career, which is what we do as a program. So this program, this fellowship / internship, really brings it all to play, where you as undergrads get an opportunity to really do some solid research, engage with people, get to know a city that's in many ways passionate, and and gets a bad rap across the country for obvious reasons in some cases, but also for the politics, but also just because it's an unknown. It's considered a city of monuments and staid culture and nothing much going on. Contrary to that, it's a fascinating place, full of passionate people doing good work, and that's what we aspire with our undergrads, is to make sure that they can come down and engage in those ways. So in a nutshell, the program is longest running at Study Abroad. Our average numbers pre-COVID were about 20 to 30. We're now in a spring or fall semester more like 10. Summertime is about 30. That being said, we've invested in the program with staff, and incidentally, full disclosure, I'm only with BU for another month and a half or so. So I've been with BU 21 years, teaching for 21 years, as director for 12. But I'm passionate about this, what I like to call a cause. It really is. It's been something that's been dear to me for a really long time, and I'm invested in it. I will continue to be as much as I can be. But we're the longest running program, and we're passionate about that. It went from being strictly Capitol Hill poli-sci to journalism to, in the last 12 years, what I've been more of my project has been to really focus on a variety of different majors. And this is where, and the NLC proposition has really been something that's helped us identify different majors and different passion projects. One summer we had 12 different majors represented. So in a nutshell, you intern Monday through Thursday, part-time or full-time. You take classes in the evening. Fridays are reserved for field trips, internship class called the Washington Experience, and guest speakers and a lunch from a different part of the city or a different part of the world. BU abroad is BU away for us because it's Washington naturally, only an hour south. But there we emphasize DC global, DC career, DC policy, issues of the day, and DC culture. So neighborhoods, food, music, the vibe, issues of the day, politics, obviously. But in addition to that is the pre-professional training component of that, which is we connect you to a mentor, probably 2 or 3 other alums, and it's I like to say it's a semester of grad school. It's a stressful semester, right? It is. You're busy. As a fellow, and this is an elevated game for all, if you're a fellow for this program, it's a semester of grad school. You're not just an intern in this sense, and I don't even like to call it that because the internships that we work with, they're challenging. But if you have a fellowship attached to this experience, it's prestigious, right? With that comes an expectation, right? That you're delivering, that you're doing good research, that you're reliable, and in the process, you're getting to know people and meet people in this process. This is great for us as IOC, but also BUDC, because this is what this event, right here, right now, I'm sorry I have to leave in a half hour, is what we had talked about for years with Professor Wilson and Stacy and I and a couple other people on the staff, was to have a presentation that sort of brings it all to light about what students do in Washington. What's the discovery like? It's great training because if you're thinking of grad school or business school or law school, this is what you end up doing. The goal here is for you to become leaders in many different ways, influence makers. You go to Washington and not just intern and meet people, but you ultimately invest in something there, whether it be advocacy, deeper research, a cause, something, right? So that's kind of what we've become in the last, that's been my sidekick on the side of BUDC, is to try to really emphasize to a variety of different majors the issues of the day, the salient issues of the day. And this is one of them, right? This is definitely one of them. So you intern Monday through Thursday, class on Fridays. We connect you to alums through a mentor program as well. You live in the heart of the city now in Chinatown on Mass Ave. And it's become more of an urban program because you're in the middle of an area that's gentrifying, that's changing left and right. That when I moved to DC in the 90s, it was not a great area for whatever that means. It changed. It's now come full circle where it's a little bit edgy at times, but I love that. I'm a city guy. I'd rather have the grit and the city and the edge and the vibe and the spirit of what the city is. I was raised in Southeast LA, so I know it. I know it well, and I'm proud of that, right? So I'd rather have students see more of that as opposed to cozy Northwest DC where it's all green and safe and whatnot, quote unquote, right? But we're becoming more of an urban program, so it fits well with that. Our office space is going from Embassy Road, DuPont Circle, Think Tank Road into the heart of Metro Center, which is also going to make it even more urban. So you'll have walking space between the office classroom space, our headquarters, and the apartment building. Apartment building is basically 4 students per apartment, 2 per room. Is it not a great building? It's a good building. It's a good building. Right? It's unlike anything else you have that's BU owned and operated and sponsored. We feed you every Friday. We provide public transportation on the metro, a little bit more reliable on the T these days, particularly. But it's a program that's just action-packed. You're busy. You come out of there, you come back to campus feeling like you've gone through a whirlwind of challenges and experiences, and you're almost like, kid you not, it's almost like you're bored when you come back to campus because you're just like, I'm just a student again. What do I do, right? I have more time on my hands and whatnot, unless you're applying to law school or something like that, and it's busy. That's kind of us in a nutshell. Cost is the same as it would cost you here on campus. So if you have financial aid or grants or loans or whatever, it will apply to DC. You'll probably save some money because, as I said, we feed you probably any chance we get with opportunities. Cost is covered for transportation. And I think you come out of there looking at the world and looking at your terrain and your career in a very different way than you do as being an undergrad here on campus. You're going to come back with a little bit more focus and a little bit more attention to those details, and you become a little bit more strategic in the way you operate. And in that process is we're working with you with a cover letter, a resume, probably a business card, an array of opportunities with informational interviews. And then not to mention, if you're a graduating senior doing the program, which we've had graduating senior, we have Tammy Dong this semester, who's a NLC Fellow, is a senior. She's probably thinking of staying in Washington and leveraging this experience potentially into a job. In fact, she just texted me an hour ago saying what's a great place to have an informational interview near the office, because she's already working it, right? She's graduating in 2 or 3 months. So that's what the program is. So if you're ready to be challenged and you want to be engaged and you're passionate about these causes, and this will be a great case study with what Ann did last year and continues to do, I think it's going to inspire you to really try to do something different and have your own legacy as you bring it back to BU. So if you're a sophomore or junior, this is the goal. We'd love to see this happen more often. If you're a graduating senior, maybe you come back as an alum and institute this tradition that we've really been proud of and happy to work with over this time. Any individual questions? Maybe I missed something, but I'm speeding.
I have a question that
Please.
Students always ask. So sorry, you were going to ask this anyway. Can you talk a little bit about how, like, the logistics of like courses, like how to course, like how do you register? What are the options? Like how does that work?
So because we're only maximum 30 students in one semester, and in post-COVID it's been more like 7 to 10 in a spring or fall. We're a little bit limited. We're CAS oriented, with an exception of maybe 1 or 2 courses that are comm oriented. That'll be more journalism, comm, ER type classes. So this democracy class, which is very relevant these days. We didn't think so 10 years ago when we first started offering the course. Democracy, of course, great out. It's the only option right now. We're elections and whatnot. It's all in play. Democracy, class on democracy, IRPO. We have a presidency class which I've taught on history, poli-sci, and IR. We have a class on the Senate. We have a class on strategies and special interests, lobbying, Capitol Hill. We have a class on government and the media, which is journalism/poli-sci. We have a class on conflict resolution, peacekeeping, an IR class, poli-sci class. We have a class on campaigns and elections if you're going more the political route. If it's a spring or fall semester, you can opt to take classes at George Washington University, which is BU's version in Washington. It's an urban campus, big, with a lot of all the amenities, library, all that. And then we're in the process, because I'm departing, with the new leadership coming in, we're likely going to reboot our offerings and classes to go a little bit more toward more breadth and depth of what DC is, either through directed study, a couple other classes in IR, poli-sci, maybe something in econ for those who are econ majors or they straddle the fence with Questrom as well. This goes with our 12 majors in one summer. To give you an idea, I have had neuroscience majors, math majors, as an example, CS majors, obviously all the CAS majors combined. So it works. You can make it work even if you're a hard science major. I've had a hard science major come to DC and take all their electives and take a class at GW. So to answer your question, David, we're a little bit limited with 5 to 6 classes. If it's a semester of 10 to 15 students, there's probably going to be 3 or 4 classes offered, mostly around CAS, some comm. But if it's a spring or fall semester, GW can fit in to that schedule with your internship as well, potentially. Other questions? I think you're here because you're interested in DC. So obviously we have all friends and no strangers here. So I think you're here because there is opportunity. This experience, guarantee you, I'll close with this, will make a difference on your resume. Somebody will see this on your resume and say, what did you do in Washington? Let's talk about that. Mark my words, somebody will ask you that if you do this program, whether you're a fellow or not. What was that experience like? How did it go? And it'll stand out in your career, whether you stay in DC or not. We hope you come back because we need young minds to do all the great work in DC that's not being done, politically particularly. but it will be an inflection point in your career, and hopefully you come back and do some really good work that's challenging, but that actually helps benefit society in some ways, because God knows we need people who care and who want to invest that kind of time. So, any other questions? Again, the fruition moment, I think this is what we had planned to do for a long time, not to put more pressure on you.
We talked about this in the office. And
We talked about it, and this has been something that this seat has been planned a while ago, so this is great for, I think, all parties involved, but hopefully, I know you'll find this interesting. He sort of did an early test run a few months into the semester there. We were like, wow, you got to redo this and present it in your own way. So thank you for having me. I'm going to be here for another 25 minutes, and I have to meet my boss, otherwise I wouldn't be leaving. But I will enjoy this in this process. Great.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I will say briefly before I start the main kind of like theory policy part of this, DC, I didn't know this before I went, it's a city that runs on interns, and Walter knows probably 20% of them. So it was always such an experience to be like, oh, there are jobs I didn't know existed, there are agencies I didn't know existed, there's so much outside of the legislative and executive branch in DC on Capitol Hill that Walter really exposed me to constantly, like outside of the NLC experience, although I'll mostly be talking about the NLC experience today. So brief overview of what we're doing.
And introduce yourself.
Oh, yes, sorry. And camera there as well. Hi, my name is An Pham. He, him pronouns. I'm an economics and mathematics major here at BU, class of 2024, College of Arts and Sciences. I started with economics and mathematics, coming from kind of a computer science background, but I got more and more interested in issues of policy. And based on the priorities I had, that brought me closer to, oh, so much of what I care about happens at the city level. And then when I found out about this at the end of my sophomore year, I went to a few Initiative on Cities events. I thought, like, okay, this fellowship is worth a shot. If I do it, it'll change the course of my junior year, and it did. And I'm very happy with where that left me, because it kind of let me like time travel like 5 years into the future, a place that I kind of wanted to work at, see what that's like in and out, and then really get to dive into a lot of topics that I really care about. So today the kind of broad structure of this, we're going to talk about what the main issue is. We're going to move into some of the more pessimistic criticisms that we were working on, like why is reform even necessary? And then what paths to reform exist, and how is that challenging? At the National League of Cities, you kind of see this day by day. I know a lot of people in poli-sci and econ say like their main experience with policy stuff might be like Model UN or student council experience. I found it so much more interesting at the National League of Cities. And then 5 is the part I'm very excited about, to put it in context of all the other political issues that I think the IOC kind of cares about. Sources linked to download the slides, all in this QR code that will be linked at the end as well. So what I got to do here in the fall semester was kind of design my own course. I really loved that part. So because Professor Lees is an expert on gentrification, I wanted to look at how did Boston get to this point in the housing market. So we started at the 1940s. This is the birth of suburbia. This is the beginning of white flight. This is about 15 years before redlining really kicks into action, right? Federal money is flowing everywhere. There's the New Deal is happening, but it's kind of conflicting with a lot of racial inequality in the United States. The massive urban transformation, and I want to dive into what was happening. Are there different city agencies involved in this? I'd never done a course like this before. Most of my coursework has been very quantitative, very focused on mathematics, and Professor Lees was able to guide me into more like thinking along the lines of sociology and history, which then shaped the classes I took in my senior year. That really mattered when I got to the Initiative on Cities. Right, like very often I was the only person in the room who would have a spreadsheet open on my laptop. That's a lot less common than the econ major would have me believe. But being able to grapple with like how is reform happening in Boston over 40 years kind of set me up to then look at, so what does reform look like today? What are the major social forces that we're dealing with today? How does federal money, state money, and like local politics all combine into this mishmash? Short story, like I like to say, it's how's the sausage made? DC is a city of many sausage factories. a big part that I care about is just policy that's outside of lawmaking. Like every day we reinterpret policy. Every day you have bureaucrats who make decisions, right? And also, frankly, those bureaucrats don't necessarily have oversight all the time or training. So it's a lot less imperfect. It's a lot less imperfect than the law, like the text of legislation would have you believe. I got to meet city staff. I got to meet experts from think tanks. I got to meet community organizers, and then researchers at the National League of Cities who they spent 20 years of their lives on an issue I had never heard about. And then after I talked to them for a lunch, I wanted to then do a PhD at that if I could. And that was just every few days. It was overwhelming and it was very interesting. And then finally, I got to get involved in the making of that. So I got to research a lot of things, recommend reforms, and then often use some of the data stuff that I picked up at BU with these cities. So I got to work on a lot of different policy teams, but the one that I ended up staying with the longest was working on an issue called fines and fees. So we kind of use these interchangeably, but I find it's helpful to separate them into fines are supposed to deter unwanted behavior. So parking tickets, that's a fine. Late fines at the library, right? These are the ideas that it's a negative economic incentive, it'll change your behavior, right? And cities want to shape behavior, right? There's so much chaos when you put this many people into one small space together. Fees, on the other hand, are supposed to cover the cost of some kind of service. So, and often this is required as punishment. So this is like you have to pay for your own drug test. You have to pay for the cost of attending court. Many people have to pay fees for their ankle monitors daily, right? And this sometimes gets tricky because it goes to for-profit or nonprofit groups sometimes who provide these services. The two things that really interested me as an econ major is, one is that fines and fees often go to public funds, right? And this creates incentives for public agencies to collect them as often as possible within their mandate. That mandate can be very tricky and confusing. It's not. In some cases it's very clear. There's a notorious case in Alabama where a town had set up a traffic trap in order to raise an average of $700 worth of traffic fees from each of the residents of this tiny town. They raised over $1 million in a year from that. But often it's a lot more complicated. It doesn't go right to the agent collecting it. Sometimes it goes to state funds, sometimes it goes to a variety of different programs. So agencies don't necessarily know what this revenue is going to and how much there is. And then the other bit is that often fines and fees go uncollected. And so someone enters into a cycle of debt with their city. And that's the big thing we're going to focus on today. We got to work with a variety of different cities. Over half of them involve the criminal justice system, which I've always been interested in, but I didn't think there was an angle into within at least the economic policy that I was interested in housing. But it was this interesting mishmash of the criminal justice system overlapping with day-to-day like civil management within a city. Each of them was tackling a very different kind of finer fee. Each of these deserves a 2-hour presentation on what these cities were doing with it. But broadly speaking, across all these different fines and fees, there's a lot of debate on whether or not they're useful or not. And this is kind of the negative side of that debate. One is just unequal enforcement. We know, anecdotally from every city that we've worked with, but also statistically from broad national studies, fines and fees are always enforced more often on racial minorities and on the low income. Sometimes this is because of just regular inequality in, say, policing and in how we do surveillance of cities, right? But this also comes because fees tend to apply to services that low-income people use more often in a city, right? You don't get slapped with a library fee unless you regularly use the library. Deterrence failure is another big criticism in that if a fine is meant to change behaviors, it doesn't do it effectively enough. One of the big cases is a lot of cities have fines for driving without insurance mandated by the state. If the root problem is that you can't afford insurance, then losing your driver's license and being slapped with fines for it doesn't make it more likely that your behavior is going to change. In many cases, it actually makes it more difficult. On the right here is a report by an advocacy group in Alabama looking at people who had court debt. And they found that 40% of the sample, 40% of the interviewees actually were pushed into committing more crimes in order to try to pay off or manage their court debt, right? So there's a big question as to whether or not this economic incentive is actually effective. And then Court debt is the other thing, as in when someone suddenly is in a state of debt with a city or a court, things can very quickly spiral out of hand. But a lot of the city staff, this was what I wasn't expecting, had very civil criticisms of it. I say civil service criticisms. One is that fees just make public services unaffordable in a lot of cases. This is a map I made for the Dallas Animal Shelter. I wasn't expecting an animal shelter to show up in our cohort. But what they found is South Dallas, which is also Black and Latino Dallas, overwhelmingly had more animals staying in shelter longer than any other group, right? And the reason for this is at Dallas Animal Shelter, when they take a pet in, they give vaccinations, they chip it, they neuter the animal if necessary, as required by law. And then a lot of pet owners cannot pay the fees to cover that service. So they have to leave their animals in the shelter. The shelter has higher costs because they have all these animals lying around, and then they have to end up putting down a lot of animals. So the service just is ineffective, right? The fee doesn't cover it, and the fee actually creates longer stays for the animals in the shelter. Another big thing, the National League of Cities initially started this project because of utilities bills, right? To reframe a lot of utilities as fees for having water, fees for having gas in a city. A big thing is fines and fees can create more costs. So we mentioned how oftentimes losing your driver's license is a part of this. Big part of this is that when you enter into a cycle of debt, you can then get hit with late fines, with interest. Sometimes cities send your things to collections. More fines and fees accrue from that. So you can quickly find that a $200 punishment escalates into a $4,000 punishment, right? And then just staffing. The cost of administering this entire system of fines and fees takes a lot of staff and takes a lot of time for cities. One thing that I found, this wasn't in a lot of research, but this was in my day-to-day because I'm also very interested in data issues, is that, how do I say this in a quicker way? So a lot of the agencies that were working with us directly at the National League of Cities, let's say this is the Office of Returning Citizens in DC, this is the Office of Racial Equity in Dallas, is not the one collecting the fine, right? So these are the offices that create a lot of progressive plans. Maybe they might be underneath the mayor, right? And they're trying to work with other city groups. Because of that, they don't necessarily have the data to then bring to city council and say, hey, you need to change this agency's mandate, we need to get rid of this bylaw or something. In that case, agencies with data, in a lot of cases we found, did not want to provide the data quickly, publicly, or in some cases even would sell the data to other city agencies, right? Which means that reforming City Hall already moves at a glacial pace, but having this back and forth of which spreadsheet are you talking about, which columns are you missing, what form do you want it in, resistance makes that a lot harder. Another bit is aggregation. So a lot of cities then, the data that they do shows totals or averages. So the city might be able to answer the question, how in debt are your residents? They can't answer the question, how much of that debt is owed by Black residents? Or how much of that debt was collected in South Dallas, right? And so this is a big thing in court as well, where a lot of court cases don't list individual cases that you can then do better analysis on. Or in some cases, they lump together entire categories of fines and fees. So maybe it's only 2 out of 7 fines that are actually problematic, but we can't disentangle that because the data that were given by agencies after different amounts of resistance is all clumped together. And then a big thing is that agencies individually don't have staff with data skills, right? The Dallas Animal Shelter has a lot of staff. They don't have an Excel person, right? Many municipal courts that we worked with didn't have a data person. So this leads to either, if you have a big enough city, then you have a research team for the city that then kind of does ad hoc work with each of these departments. I found just anecdotally that it's really good work, but it's very inconsistent because they often don't have they can't spend the attention needed for this long process. Like I was here for a year, right? These reforms take years. Or you work with an outside group, so a nonprofit like the National League of Cities, maybe a university. In a lot of cases, cities paid for very expensive data contractors. And as helpful as these contractors are, if you don't already have a data person on your staff, it's hard to tell how effective the data contractor is going to be then, right? There's this fundamental gap of skills in cities. I was very excited. I got to make this for a town in Illinois. This was, their issue was when in a lot of states, if you're behind on your property taxes, the county can sell the right to collect those taxes to an investor. In Illinois, those interest rates start at 18% and they can go up to 45%. If you fail to pay after a certain amount of time, they can foreclose on your home. So this means you might be behind $2,000 in taxes, you end up losing $800,000 worth of your family's savings at the end, right? And this was, I was able to go through public records for this and then figure out the different banks that had been flipping the most homes in this majority black town in Illinois, kind of like the worst offenders. And then the city mayor was able to reach out to some of these banks who were supposed to be city partners directly. But this kind of thing is just for one city, just at one snapshot in time, right? When you're doing reform, you need consistent amounts of data to readjust, look at different fines. And ideally, you don't want to be relying on one intern from one university who's going to be gone in a few months. So what can we do about it? Or what are we trying to do about it? I found that across all of the staff we worked with, each city team at NLC is kind of interesting. There's usually a leader from, say, like the main department being affected, or say a racial equity department, and then a lot of different city staff that they slowly bring in who are related to the process. And each of these staff had different priorities, right? A lot of them said, well, fines hurt residents. So they were immediately focused on how can we reduce debt, forgive it, how can we lower the consequences of it? Let's say, let's stop suspending driver's licenses, right? Let's look at that. Some staff were very interested in the fact that because so much of it was uncollected debt, it's just hard to collect on. So this is not reliable as a replacement for tax money to fund our department with. Deterrence was a really big issue in convincing issue in municipal courts, where municipal courts said, hey, we still want to change behavior or enforce the law in some way, and these fines just aren't doing the job as well, and it's wasting our time. And then as well with municipal courts, that the fines and fee system is in lots of places inefficient, right? And so one of the things that made me interested, right, was even if the fines or fees seem wrongful in the first place, a lot of reform groups simply go towards, well, we'll just administer them more fairly, right? And so we'll collect data on it, we'll try to reallocate staff, but that's very different from a lot of these other concerns. And I can say anecdotally as well, with the other policy issues I worked with at NLC, these different schools like this would always exist within a cohort, and a big part of reform is learning about these personalities, managing them to some degree, and then being open to what the city is asking for out of your organization. We're not going to go through that because that'll take a little longer. And because, as you saw earlier, we worked with, I think, 10 cities in just this fines and fees cohort. Each of these cities had about 5 staff. Each of them were recommending different reforms, and they were warming to them over time. Lots of different solutions kind of pop up. I would rank them kind of from the idea of debt abolition down to the idea of debt reform. At the very top, debt abolition argues that, well, the debt is wrongful, just get rid of it. Or remove as much of it as possible. Or let's say if you don't have a legal way to, say, cancel all the debts that someone has today, let's remove the source of that debt. So this is no longer a fine or fee in this way, right? We'll change that part of it. And kind of going down, you have ability to pay is a really big idea in a lot of cities right now, where you have the initial fine and then we will reduce it based on your income, right? So the idea then is not to reduce the source of debt, but to reduce the likelihood that you're trapped in that cycle for too long. A big part of this is also offering payment plans for fines and fees. One thing that really interested me was vouchers. So this is from the deterrence camp, where a lot of people argue. So the fine isn't going to change the problem, because the root source of it was you didn't have the money to, let's say, have insurance or, say, fix your tail light. So some cities have actually instituted, police will hand out a voucher to say, rather than a $200 fine for this tail light, which will then send you to court, which will then force us to do 3 hours of staff money, we're going to give you a $200 voucher to go to a mechanic, get that fixed right away. You solve it at the root there. Collections reform, and as you see, we're moving closer towards reform, where we say, well, we can't change the amount of debt, we're just going to change how it's how we go about collecting it. So refusing to work with certain debt contractors, refusing to have high interest rates, right? Financial counseling was a really interesting one. It kind of caught me off guard. Because in my mind, the root cause is often, the main reason someone doesn't pay off their fines and fees is not that they don't have the discipline to, but because a lot of fines and fees are seen as like a social obligation, financial counseling was often paired with a lot of these more abolitionist reforms to make them more palatable, right? So we would say, so a court might say, well, we're going to eliminate debt on the condition that you attend financial counseling courses with us. And at the very bottom is just, we're not sure what we're going to do yet, but we're going to figure out what the situation is. And this is collect data. This might be like requiring that fines and fees are public records. We require, and for example, we require that tax revenue in most places in the United States is public records. So we can debate about that. We can talk about whether or not it's fair, whether it's the right amount, whether it's being spent in the right way, right? To require that if you do collect fines and fees or if you use it in your public funds, it should be public information. And then this also solves some of the staffing issue, right? Because if it's solely information that's within each agency, you need dedicated people in those agencies to analyze it. But when it's public records, like what I was able to do with the bank information, you can afford to have researchers from the outside moving faster. You can have community experts moving a little bit faster. So to put this all in context, right? Because this, in my mind, when I came to it, I was like, oh, this is kind of a niche field, but it ties into a lot of what I'm interested in with economics and mathematics and this big data problem that we had. But I quickly found that it sprawled into a lot of other political issues that I was looking at, even in like classes that I was taking when I went home from the office. One is just the debt crisis. The United States is going through a debt crisis. Medical bankruptcies, we're at a university, student loans are on everyone's mind, right? And so a lot of the arguments around loan reform in general, arguments of interest rates being too high, arguments of collections being too punitive, apply to the issue of fines and fees, right? Justice system reform is another one. Because fines and fees are, I wasn't really expecting this, but fines and fees are so heavily used within administering the justice system that very often a city might find, okay, so we were just starting to look at library fines, but now we're realizing that on the principle that these library fines are unfair, these other fines that exist kind of like tenfold also in our city, in the justice system, that's the next step to look at, right? I mentioned ankle monitors. In general, court fees can be incredibly, incredibly expensive. It gets to a point where you might get sentencing for the initial punishment for whatever crime you did, but then to pay for that process, you have hundreds of other fees attached to it. Right? And that kind of ties into the third thing where in the United States, it's expensive to be poor. Being poor makes you more likely to be incarcerated, and then it becomes incredibly expensive to be incarcerated, in large part due to fines and fees. I would even recontextualize some of these things as like commissary fees. The cost of calling home from a jail can be, I think, can be seen in the same way as a like administrative fee in court, right? This is, we'll get into the next bit. Some of the framings that aren't like maybe as policy focused, but I like to think of this as certain ideas popped up in this discussion with all these city staff. City staff are not like, they're not completely detached people. They're very passionate folks who all came to work in public service for different reasons. And these were some of the framings that I found moved them a lot. One is the idea that the debt quantifies how much you owe back to the city. You've done some kind of wrong, you maybe violated the social contract, and so it's really tricky for us to undo that debt because we can say, oh, you have this much social obligation left to fulfill. Even if on closer inspection, that amount is very inflated because of, interest rates, because of late fees, because of other things like that. The second one is equality under law, right? If you have enough money in a city, right, a speeding ticket is like ordering an extra coffee. It's like ordering fries to move through space. But if you don't, then it can become a 5-year hassle for you and your family, right? 3 is the idea of public services. Should we fund these through day-to-day fees of the people who use them, right? Or should we fund this just through like more general tax revenue, right? One big thing is in a lot of court systems, fees directly go to victims' funds, right? And that makes it difficult to then say this fee should be untangled. But the tricky thing is that victims fund, maybe that should be funded through the state more generally. It's a more stable source, right? It doesn't immediately extract from, an incredibly poor population. And it's more, yeah, that kind of thing, right? And this will vary across the different public services provided. Maybe, and like there are a lot of public services where fees are necessary. This debate also constantly rages on within transit, right? Who should pay for it? Is it at the moment of service with your ticket, or is it just a broader thing that we provide together? And then fourth, this is one that I really care about, is should we change behavior through fines and fees directly, or should we design our cities in a way that shapes behavior better, right? So should you have police officers who are going around a city and kind of concentrating in certain parts of the city enforcing speeding tickets, or should you simply have speeding bumps, right? Should you design your streets better in some way? Can you set up better design in other cases, like in some cases, like late fees are meant to disincentivize you from not paying your debt, right? But in a lot of cases, or let's say fees for not showing up to your court case are meant to incentivize you to go to court, right? In a lot of cases, people don't fulfill that obligation, fulfill that financial obligation because they don't know, right? So a lot of courts are working on things like, okay, we're not going to use these punishments right away. We're going to spend that money on having an automated text system that lets people know, hey, your payment's due. Hey, you need to come to court for this. And then also, frankly, looking at some whether or not the work of administering these fines and fees should be done mostly by the people who owe them, or should the state take a more proactive role? Broadly speaking, I think the interesting question is, like, what do we owe to those who are in debt to society, right? Wherever that debt is. I think we owe an investigation of what's the source of their debt, what was the purpose of that debt in the first place, right? Fines and fees are very different than other kinds of debt, and even for the student loan debate, there's an argument of, well, we provided you some amount of money and resources, and so you must pay that back in due time and compensate us through interest. There are issues with that too, right? But in the case of a fine or fee, the city has not really provided people who are in debt to the city with anything that then the interest makes up for, right? So I think we, at the city level, a lot of what we were doing at NLC was going deeper into this, as in, like, people with debt are also still residents. They also still use public services. How can this system quickly isolate them away from all of that? So these are kind of summaries. I love reading reports, so NLC was kind of a dream job because I got paid to just go through page after page of PDF. Each of these is like 70 pages. I know that doesn't make it more likely that you'll read them. But yes, please feel free to reach out to me after. All of them are linked in here. I will end with all the criticism and negativity. The only reason we know about this is because people have been working on this for decades, right? And that was something that I kept. There was kind of like a cycle whenever I encountered something new at NLC. I would learn about it. I'd be interested. I'd have to grapple with the reality and harm that a lot of issues in our cities entail, and that would be scary. It would be scary as a student, right? Because then you're in the middle of this big city where all these things are happening. And then I've learned about everyone who made it possible for me to even know about that, and then what I could do to help them. And that was just the most fantastic feeling. I think it's shaped how I'm going to move about the next 10, 20 years of my life. More importantly, the next 5 months, because I graduated. And yeah, so thank you so much. This is just one of the things I got to work on at NLC, and it was intensely rewarding. So if we have any questions, and let me know if you want me to zip back and forth any slides. Yeah.
Yeah, so at the start you begin with the distinction between fines and fees.
Yeah.
Where fines are tools of deterrence and fees are linked to specific city services.
Yeah.
What do the reform approaches vary between these two categories?
Yes.
Yes, yeah.
Because for fees, cities were much less concerned with changing behavior.
Okay.
So and fees are often more of like a bureaucratic decision. Also, unless the service is provided right away, fees don't tend to rack up debt, right? Because you pay it at the moment of service. So the bigger problem with fees is that you turn people away from some kind of public service. In court cases, though, these really start to blend together because if the fee is attached to whatever reason you're in court, then it can start to look a lot like a fine. Yeah.
That was a wonderful presentation, like really terrific research, like so well done and put together and so interesting. In this area, I've often thought about climate action and kind of, I think currently a lot of local leaders are looking at incentivizing greener behavior, right? More climate friendly behavior, whether put solar on your home, we'll give you a tax credit, right? Compost, we'll drop off the materials, pick it up on your curb. But I wonder, as we kind of head into the future, and we know we need to make change, right, for climate, do you think more cities can be looking at like fines and fees, like take congestion pricing, like New York just implemented it. Boston City Council's doing research looking into congestion pricing, like things like that. Like, did you come across that in your research or in your discussion with NLC folks? Or
That's really interesting. It wasn't in this cohort. I'm full disclosure. I'm still working with NLC on a different project with their health and wellness team. So we're doing a lot about like climate, about city planning, right? That's been more of a zoning thing. I'm trying to clear out in my head. I think though I think an interesting thing would be looking at whether or not this congestion pricing is one, does it actually change behavior in a meaningful way, right? Can you price people out of driving to work if you don't have a public transit system is a big question. And then if so, where will that revenue go? I think there is some exciting stuff around climate work where because we haven't set up like where that money is going to go yet, we can directly put it back into climate action. So let's say in that hypothetical funding that traffic system. But then also a lot of the subsidies I think are kind of relate to some of the voucher issues that were mentioned here, right? Where we want to encourage you to behave in a certain way, so we're going to give you the resources to do it. One of the cities who worked with Las Vegas, they were very proactive. So instead of immediately moving in if your property was not up to code, they would connect you to different funding sources and say, like, hey, the main issue here is that your lawn is unsafe. Let's get you the money you need if that's the case and whatnot. So yeah.
Yeah, I think that should be a really cool area as you continue this research to think about climate action, because I do think there's going to be a change there.
No, absolutely. And then also the question of like, fines and fees are very different when it's for individuals versus very large organizations. And we're a lot more effective at administering these on individuals than we are on, say, companies, small businesses, who might have, in that case, maybe deterrence is more effective. Yeah, but thank you.
That was so fantastic. I've worked with the organization Alabama Appleseed in Alabama through my last organization. They're amazing. Leah's amazing. So really, like, they're doing really transformative work there. I was wondering, because I was introduced to this whole concept in Alabama Appleseed through, like, they were doing state-based advocacy. I'm curious about, like, I hadn't really thought about it through a city lens. So I'm curious if you could say anything about what NLC is doing to sort of, fines and fees fall under so many jurisdictions, right? Like there's the courts, the state, the city, the federal government. Like how are they thinking about the role of cities and also how to like bridge all of those jurisdictions that are really like facilitating this system? That's
a great question. And I remember feeling like if I'd go into a meeting, I'd ask the other NLC staff, like, what level of government are we working with? Is this county? Is this state? Right? So I think two parts. One is briefing cities on if like reform energy comes from the city, to be like, who are your allies at different levels of government? Helping them map out, like, maybe you're collecting this, but it goes to a state fund. Or maybe the 2 out of 7 of these are actually in your control and the other 5 are mandated by state law. So we'll help you figure out if the 2 out of 7 is the main root of the problem or not. A big thing though is like, I think the state level is so important because the state level has a big impact on criminal justice policy, but the civil fines and fees, the day-to-day management of a city, there's an immense role that cities can play. And again, one of the initial things that started this was looking at municipal water bills, right? And people being late on their water bills. So a lot of the same debates over this and reform approaches map over into that, which are more often under cities' controls. But one of the fascinating things was that city governments were so different and varied across the United States One of the NLC staffers told me that some don't have a website. They let you know when the elections are on their Facebook page. So it was, yeah, so like moving across those levels of government was always really interesting.
Yeah.
So, thank you.
Thank you, this was so wonderful.
So when you're talking about like fines are just so prevalent in the Justice Department, is it to a level where that is the funding for like the court system in the city? So if you were to say like let's remove them, it is like that's saying you have to raise taxes, or?
I think broadly no. So Urban Institute has some really good research on fines and fees actually only make up in some cases like 0.1 to 2% of all funding for cities and states at large. For different agencies it's different. But the tricky thing is not that the entire court system would fall apart if you stopped fines and fees, but that specific programs would fall apart. So let's say the Victims Fund in Alabama would fall apart, right? And then that in my mind gives me a little bit of hope because it's much easier to then say, okay, write that into another, like, supply that fund from like another source of revenue in the state, rather than figure out how to redo, like this entire police department. Also because the court system gets a lot more sustainable funding than a lot of these other offices. A big thing though is that like with the Dallas Animal Shelter example, it's just that if you remove fines and fees, they have to come up with a new way to provide certain services. So that might not be like the victims fund goes away, but that then means Dallas Animal Shelter is no longer able to provide this amount of stuff. That kind of thing. But yeah, great question.
Can I add something to that? That was interesting of like some of the research I was working on in Alabama was that they actually had a researcher study how much money is the state losing when they're trying to chase after those fees, and they actually were able to do an economic analysis that it's $800 per person that they're actually, not only are they not gaining the money back, they're losing $800 per person when they're not having people who don't have driver's license to get to work. They're, funding people, bureaucrats to like chase after people. People are reincarcerated, right? And so they're actually, Alabama does fund a lot of their government on criminal justice system, and so they were basically like, oh, we're actually not, you think that we need to find that money elsewhere, but actually we're spending that money to get those there, which is pretty interesting.
Yeah, absolutely.
Actually, what she just talked about sparked a question for me. I'm from New York City, and recently, in the past year or so, I haven't experienced it because I haven't been there, but I've heard from family members and friends and such that there's been a large, under the new mayor who was elected, I think 2 years ago, there's been a huge amount of effort to combat fare evasion on the transit system, and pretty much every statistic about the increased policing in subway stations, they're in the process of replacing the fare gates. Pretty much every figure points to the fact that the amount of money being prevented or fare evasion that's being combated in terms of a money amount is less than the amount of money that they're spending. So my question is, I think this connects to your research, what do you think is sort of the motivation by the city to spend more money combating said problems than the actual problems themselves?
I think that's a great question, and also fare evasion is something I hope to look at, like kind of in the next few years, because we do need to fund public transit somehow. Most likely, source right now is probably going to be more state and federal money if we get lucky with that, right? But not all cities are. I would say that kind of goes to this, in that, and this is kind of something I was happy to see outside of when I stepped out of my economics classes, in that we tend to think of the most rational choice for a city is to like this massive one budget that it has and then it optimizes how it spends, right? But cities are very willing to spend money on things that don't make money. And in a lot of cases, I think the other priorities of like deterrence, of needing to keep up what it thinks is like its public safety interests and whatnot. I was going to quote my good friend Gideon is here. I was going to quote some stuff he mentioned about IR and how much like states spend on security. I'm not going to go into that though because I don't know the vocabulary well enough, right? But it's that I think we can make the argument for how inefficient the money is if that agency cares about spending that money inefficiently, and if they know they're going to run out of that money.
Yeah.
Right? But if the core goal is we need to keep up some kind of image, we need to project some kind of interest, and sometimes that can be a valid interest, then that's not going to work. And I think like one of the angle I thought you were going for that I heard about was the new New York budget cuts down a lot of library spending.
That too.
Right? And there's this constant debate of like, yeah, so what does
And
this mean for
budgets taken away from public schools as well?
Yes.
The lowest since like the 90s.
Right, so
percentage-wise.
we put a lot of pressure on certain public services, like say libraries and schools, to be cost effective, that we don't put on a lot of other public services, like say transit.
Yeah.
Yeah, or security. So, thank you.
So that was awesome, man. Thank you so much. I know we're just about time, so I just wanted to do a couple things. So one, you sort of buried the lead, but Anne was offered over the summer at the conclusion of his fellowship, which ended at the end of the spring semester, by the NLC to work part-time, or work full-time over the summer, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Full-time.
So they hired him separate from the fellowship over the summer.
Yeah.
And now you're working part-time remote for the National League of Cities, so congratulations. And the other thing I wanted to just flag is the National League of Cities, you did all this work supporting the efforts of the National League of Cities and the work that they're doing. And a lot of this work is coming from the National League of Cities and their staff because they hear cities asking questions and wanting resources about it. So the National League of Cities provides, this is less of a question, but more of an observation, is the National League of Cities provides a lot of resources to cities and towns because cities and towns don't have giant research departments to be able to put all this together. So they often rely on organizations like the National League of Cities to inform them of where they're being inefficient or ways that they could improve. So a lot of city officials come to the National League of Cities asking for research on something, and so this is how all of this fits in.
Yeah, and one thing that you mentioned to me when we went to like an NLC conference, that was like, you see yourself as an academic, where do you want to be in the pipeline for information?
Yeah.
And I remember feeling at the time that waiting 10 years to then maybe do a big research project to then maybe inform some theory, that was really exciting to me because you can get really in the weeds with it and stay in academia, right? But there's something so rewarding about being like, oh, we have 20 years backlog of good ideas to try, and there's people who want to move on. Like that as well, to figure out like maybe like reschedule what our policy and research agenda should be for the next few years, right? And yeah, it doesn't really happen, and this is not in a vacuum. This was like I got to work with incredible staff who were on the scene a lot longer than I was, and are continuing to work on all this. Yeah, it was just kind of, I could go on forever about this. It was such a bizarre year, and now the fact that we're coming up on a year since the experience is a little bit overwhelming, but very, very, very gratifying and very exciting. Thank you all so much.
Yeah. Thank you. So, just really quickly for everybody, if you go to the initial in cities is bu.edu/IOC. You don't have to memorize that part that's highlighted. If you go to for students on the homepage, internships and fellowships, and it's going to be the top one that pops up, and you can learn more about. You'll see the last year's information here. We're just in the process of updating it, but it won't change much. And this is where the application will be for those of you who are here. And again, if you registered for the event, you'll get more information. Yeah.
I'm a little bit unclear on, so there's two parts to it.
Mm-hmm.
There's the fellowship in the fall. So one part is in Boston and then the spring.
Yeah, so it's a full year commitment. Basically what happens is you enroll in a directed study with Loretta Lees in the fall semester. So what most students do is they drop a course, or alternatively, they have room for some extra credits and they do a 2 or 3 credit.
Whatever.
Yeah, I generally don't recommend an overload unless that's absolutely what you need, but if you need it, that's totally normal. I think, did you do an overload in DC?
I think I did.
Yeah, I would not recommend that. If you're gonna do your overload, do it in the fall, not in the spring. It'll keep you busy. It's still a good experience, but it'll keep you busy. So there's different ways you can fit that in. It can be anywhere from 2 to 6 credits, so you can like sort of work to fit it in.
Okay. And it
You'll-
starts in the fall or in the summer?
It starts in the fall.
Okay.
So you take a directed study. Essentially, is basically self-guided research. You'll do it under the supervision of a faculty member who will help guide you. You'll pick a topic, and the faculty member will sort of guide you on that topic and you'll have like regular meetings, and you'll have usually 1 or 2 essays or papers or something, depending on how many credits and things like that. But it's basically a course, sort of like a different type of a course, but it's a course that you take in the fall semester. And so as part of this, you get a directed study with Loretta Lees. So we would help you with the ad drop process of that. We help you get all the paperwork done to get a directed study on your calendar or on your schedule. And then in the spring semester, so during the fall semester, you then separately, you've already been accepted to the fellowship, say, you separately apply to DC's internship program, which is what Walter
You have
is
to do
doing.
both?
Yeah, you have to do both, yeah.
Okay.
So the reason that you have to do both, so first, just to say, so in the spring semester, then you go to DC, you do the DC program, you have this internship. The reason that you have to do both the directed study and the DC program and the NLC internship is we wanted to create something. Mayor Menino was an urbanist. He was someone who really believed in the power of cities, and he believed really powerfully in in terms of the work of the National League of Cities. But he also believed really strongly in an urban education, which is part of the reason he came to the Initial Cities, found it. And so when we were creating this fellowship, we really wanted to create something that served all purposes of it. It wasn't just an internship. We have other internship programs. The DC program already existed, and there were already you could go to the DC program and find your own internship. You could do a directed study on your own as well. So we wanted to sort of figure out a way, well, how can we get a student a holistic experience? And so we said, well, the faculty director of the Initial Cities is always an urbanist. It used to be Graham Wilson, now it's Loretta Lees. The DC program, we can guarantee you this paid internship with the National League of Cities, which is an amazing organization. And so we sort of partnered with the DC program on that to make that happen. And so combined, we have this whole fellowship essentially. But there are ways you could go to DC without it. You wouldn't necessarily be at the National League of Cities.
No, I mean, definitely the directed study part is extremely interesting to me.
Yeah.
I'm just sort of thinking ahead about, personally, logistically, if I could make DC happen.
Yeah.
So maybe I'll
But yeah, so my name's David Gross. My email's here.
So maybe I'll email.
Yeah, absolutely.
Set your own time.
Yeah.
Other options or
Yeah,
stuff.
absolutely. That's definitely something I would encourage. If you're concerned about fitting study abroad in, the Global Programs Office is a great resource, as well as your advising. Your advisor can help you fit it in. One of the tools that some students have used in the past is the GW option. So if they need a certain credit in the spring semester, for example, you can take it at GW. It does become a little challenging with your schedule. So you might have to find a night class, or you might have to work something out with NLC so that you're not taking classes while you're working. I don't think you didn't choose that option, right?
No, I did
all the DC, yeah. So that is something that you could pursue the possibility of.
Yeah. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
All right.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And I'll say we've had you can be our current NLC fellow is a senior, so you can actually go abroad your spring semester senior year if you're eager to get your credits and then you want to apply when you're a senior. I would say the average student applying is a sophomore probably who's planning to abroad or do their semester away when they're a junior, which I think is fairly common. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I gotta head out.
So,
Excuse me.
yeah, and thank you all so much for coming and for supporting Anne and for being your interest in the fellowship. Like I said, you'll get an email at the end of the week from me when the application opens. And yeah, that was awesome, man. Thank you so much.
Thank you all so much.